This is Rabbi Jeffrey Sacks, editor of Tradition. In this episode of our podcast, Tzvi Sinensky, co-editor of our special double issue on the intellectual legacy of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, speaks with author Alex Israel about his essay in the volume Not by Might, Aversion to Power in Rabbi Sacks' Writings. They begin with Rabbi Sacks' 2016 debate with Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, which played out on the pages of the Jewish Review of Books, concerning Judaism's complicated relationship with power. From there, the conversation turns to Rabbi Sacks' readings of Breshit as a rejection of myth and his vision of Tselem Elokim, the divine image, as a moral counterweight to power. They discuss how Rabbi Sacks imagined a covenantal society bound by a shared narrative, and how he might have responded in the wake of October 7th. Visit traditiononline.org for more information about this special volume, the largest in our journal's nearly 7-decade history, and also see links to purchase a copy if you're one of the few who are not otherwise a subscriber. Rabbi Alex Israel, author, podcaster, and international lecturer, teaches at Midreshet Lindenbaum, Yeshivat Eretz Hatzvi, and for the Rabbi Sacks Legacy. Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sinensky is director of the Lamb Legacy Project and director of Jewish Studies at Mainline Classical Academy. Here's their conversation.
Welcome, Rabbi Alex. It's a pleasure to be here together.
And great to be with you, Rabbi Tzvi.
Okay, looking forward to this conversation. Really, ever since I saw your initial article in the Rabbi Sacks volume, which is incredibly exciting, I felt like you chose something, this theme of Rabbi Sacks and power, that is incredibly important to Rabbi Sacks' thought in its own right, and yet also opens, of course, so many questions that are perennially important, but I think in particular over the last 2 years since, of course, the beginning of the war. So I've been saying to myself for some time, I've got to get Rav Alex, at least in a virtual room, if not in an actual room. So this is hopefully a first step toward that, but really an opportunity for us to jump in and to really discuss. So thank you so much. I want to start. I know you begin your article with a conversation between Rabbi Sacks, an exchange between Rabbi Sacks and Rabbi Riskin in the Jewish Review of Books. Tell us a little bit about that. What caught your attention, and what really drew you to that back and forth?
Yeah, so the truth is, it was a really interesting process, because I'd been reading quite a lot of Rabbi Sacks for a long time, and I'd noticed this theme of a sort of how should I call it, an aversion to power on the side of Rabbi Sacks. Many times in his writings, he talks about how averse he is to the notion of power, the notion of how he values freedom and choice, and so many things like that. In fact, one of the themes to do with this week's Parashat Shavua, to do with Brit Milah, where he actually talks about Brit Milah as curbing the alpha male, right? He quotes the Moreh Nevuchim, who sees it some sort of the reason why we perform circumcision on the male sexual organ is some sort of curbing of sexual desire. And Rabbi Sacks sees sexual desire and power very dangerous things, and that we need that sort of reminder. And I was trying to figure out a topic for the article, and I went to a friend of mine, Rabbi Gideon Sylvester, and he said, well, of course, there's that debate in the Jewish Review of Books, and I had never come across it. And it was quite remarkable. Let me just, for all of our listeners, let me initiate them. So Rabbi Sacks had written a book in 2015 called Not in God's Name. And it was reviewed in the Jewish Review of Books by Rabbi Riskin. And Rabbi Riskin said, this is a great book, this is a tour de force, but he says, here's my one problem with Rabbi Sacks. The Rabbi Sacks has this disdain of power, and he likes Jewish powerlessness, he even went. Now, it's difficult not to agree with Rabbi Riskin when you see that two of the chapters there, one is called Relinquishing Power. That's one of Rabbi Sacks's chapters. And the other one is called The Will to Power or The Will to Life, right? Chapter 15. In other words, and just to understand, the will to power is a phrase that he gets from Nietzsche. So he's basically saying either you've got power or life, and we've got to relinquish power. So Rabbi Riskin had a pretty good point, and he said, listen, Rabbi Sacks, after the Holocaust, we can't afford to be powerless anymore. And this idea that you have an aversion to power, Rabbi Sacks always used to like to quote Lord Acton, that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And he said, "I'm sorry, we need power. We need power for as a Jewish people. That's why we've got Medinat Israel." And he's basically accused Rabbi Sacks of misrepresenting Judaism, and to a certain degree, not really understanding Medinat Israel. To which Rabbi Sacks responded and says, "What are you talking about? I love Medinat Israel, and after the Holocaust, I would never suggest that Jewish power is relinquished. But," says Rabbi Sacks, "I'm very nervous about the role of power, even in Medinat Israel. So, of course, we have to wield power, but what about, for example, religious parties who are trying to force the role of religion through the power of the Knesset? That is a corrupting force on religion." And he says, the power of Avraham Avinu, which has powered all the monotheistic religions in the world, is that he didn't command any armies and that he didn't own any territory, but he had these powerful ideas. Rabbi Riskin's rejoinder was, excuse me, Avraham Avinu did lead an army to save his nephew Lot, and Avraham Avinu was promised a land which would be a real political entity of the Jewish people. It wasn't realized in his lifetime, but that was the plan. So we have quite an interesting clash there. And then this really led into a very interesting discussion, because I read all of these pieces by Rabbi Sacks about his aversion to power. And then the question is, how does this sort of come back into Medinat Israel? Because Rabbi Sacks was an avid Zionist, a tremendous supporter of Medinat Israel. His wife told me that the first thing he did when he retired was to invest in an apartment in Eretz Israel. He wanted to, more than anything else, live in Yerushalayim. He unfortunately never got to live really for very long in that apartment, but he saw himself as a passionate Zionist ever since his childhood B'nai Akiva days. So the question is how the two go together.
Yeah, fascinating. We'll come back to that further, but that's a super helpful frame. And but you argue it's very interesting. Even before Avraham Avinu, you point out that really Rabbi Sacks's reading of the importance of placing proper checks on power really goes back to the beginning of the Torah, not just to the beginning of the Jewish nation, but really to Bereshit. Can you elaborate a little bit? That's his arguments about myth and where that comes from.
So sure. So, Rabbi Sacks has got this wonderful book, A Letter in the Scroll, or as it's called in England, Radical Then, Radical Now. I always wonder why he chose a different name for America, but maybe the word radical was too radical for America. I don't know. But what he does in that book is he starts going through really the Torah. And he's fascinating by the fact that Judaism is a radical shift in civilization. And what does he mean by that? He says, well, before Judaism, you had a pagan world. And when you think about mythology is very hierarchical. The gods are all fighting with each other, and the strongest god is the head of the pantheon, right? By the way, that's the root of we're recording this on Parshat Lech Lecha, and we have the famous midrash about Avram smashing the idols. And that is the foundation of that midrash. Avram says to his father, right? Why do you smash idols? He says, well, somebody came in with a korban and they all had a fight. And the strongest one, smashed all the others, and he's got the club in his hand. That's really the world of mythology, whereby you have a pantheon, and the head of the pantheon is the strongest. I always say that in the pagan world, the gods are in the image of man. They have jealousy. They backstab each other, they fight, they kill each other, they're jealous, they're fearful. That's the pagan world, and there's no reason to be hopeful in a world like that, because there's no consistency in the gods, and it's a very scary world when you've got these super powerful forces who only wield power all the time. Says Rabbi Sacks, suddenly God gave us a new narrative. It's called Bereshit, and in Bereshit, God is outside the world. God is not a natural force. He's not a force of nature. God is above the world, and God created a world with order. Bereshit is a world, an ordered world. God says this is a good world. And God believes in man, and he makes every human being in his image. What is his image? His image is that he is a free God because he's not bound by nature. He is an ordered God, and he asks us to create order in the world. Every person has dignity, because in the ancient world, it was only the kings who were in the images of gods. The kings were gods, they were demigods. But now human beings have been given inherent worth. And if I can add one further piece to this, what's the alternative to power? The alternative to power is not only freedom, but it is communication by words. God created the world through language, and we create relationships through language. If you don't have power in society, how will you create cohesion in society? It is through trust, and trust can be created by promises, by the promises we make. So much so that already in chapter 2, you have the first marriage, so to speak, which is affected by a statement. Adam Arishon says, "Zot hapam etzem me'atzamai ubasar mibsari lezot tikarei isha ki me'ish lukach hazot." This is the bone of my bone, the flesh of my flesh. She should be called Isha ki me'ish lukach hazot. And what's interesting is until this point, man's never called himself Ish. No one ever called him Ish. Rabbi Sacks says, you have to see the other before you see yourself. We create relationships with words. And now the test of Sefer Bereshit is going to be whether you use power or whether you affect things through relationships, which are created through words. By the way, the relationship between God and Israel is not one of power. Despite the midrash of Kafa Aleim Har Kagigit, that God held the mountain over their heads, that is rejected by the Talmud, as it's a nice midrashic flourish. But eventually they say, no, we had to accept the Torah through free will. And that happened when Kimu v'Kiblu, when the Jews accepted the Torah freely. And in fact, in the Pshat of Sefer Shemot, we're asked 3 times, will you accept the Torah? One time we say Naseh, the second time we say Naseh, the third time Naseh v'nishma. You cannot impose, says Rabbi Sacks, through power. You cannot impose your way on somebody else because that is invalid. And he displays this through many, many, many different ways. So for Rabbi Sacks, this one of the primary things is Tselem Elokim, the image of God, which gives you freedom, which gives you free will, and power is an inappropriate way of organizing society.
Sure, and that's all super helpful frame, and really I think helps me and our listeners hopefully to really appreciate where Rabbi Sacks is really drawing from. But at the same time, it kind of seems a little bit troubling. It kind of raises the question, come back to Rabbi Riskin, which is that on the one hand, perhaps in some of these earlier kind of what are often called the prehistorical narratives, in the first 11 chapters of Bereshit, perhaps we can see where Rabbi Sacks would develop these themes, and in many ways, one might argue that he spends Rabbi Alex, a lot of time focusing on those 11 chapters, not just in the books you mentioned, but in the Dignity of Difference I'm thinking of, and elsewhere as well. But then we come to some of the particularistic narratives, and you seem at first glance really a little bit of a different story. How would Rabbi Sacks respond specifically about Rabbi Riskin's argument from Avraham Avinu? He did command armies, but more than that, later on, of course, into Sefer Dvarim and Sefer Yoshua in particular, the Jewish people are commanded to build an army to destroy the land of Canaan, to seize it for themselves. These are all possessive, and this, of course, goes back to a degree to Avraham Avinu himself. How do you think Rabbi Sacks would did he ever actually directly address these issues? How would you guess he might begin to tackle them?
Yeah, so I want to respond to this in 2 ways, in 2 levels.
Yeah.
The first thing is whether Rabbi Sacks talks about the notion of a king. And Rabbi Sacks likes talking about, Rabbi Sacks' basic paradigm that he talks a lot is the paradigm of the covenant. And again, the covenant is affected by words. It's a commitment which is taken, free will. It's an agreement. It's a contract. Rabbi Sacks says that the first contract, the first covenant was at Sinai. That was the first national covenant which we made with God to live according to God's will. But many years later, when we already had a land, we then made a covenant with a king. Now, which one is primary? And Rabbi Sacks says that actually it is the covenant of Sinai which forms the essence of the Jewish people, even when we don't have a land and we don't have the trappings of a nation. He even says that, therefore, when we go into galut, when we go into exile, we still exist as a people because we're not contingent on having a country or a constitution. Our constitution is the Torah. And that question is, how do we live? Then there's another question, which is how do we live as a state, where a state needs an army, we need protection. The people ask for a king so that they can be protected from their enemies. There we need somebody to take taxes and to organize the nation. Then Hashem says, and by the way, even then, God's a little, is this a good idea? Shmuel's not so happy about it, right? He says, sure, you can have a king. So for Rabbi Sacks, the ideal, so to speak, the basics, the basic crustacean, the basic stratum of living is the Torah. And on top of that sits another strata, which is an organizational, procedural, let's call it, covenant, which is the covenant of the king, which is very important. That has religious overtones. By the way, the Torah is very worried about power, right? The Torah says, don't have too many wives, don't have too many horses, don't have too much money, don't get too into the trappings of governance. It tries to keep it tries to keep the king humble, and therefore, and the king has to carry a Sefer Torah with him. That's the constitution of the king in some way. The king has to be loyal to the Torah. So there's no doubt that for Rabbi Sacks, religion first and state second. So that's the first answer I would give to your question. The second is that when it comes to what you mentioned, which is coming into the land and being given a command to kill the nations of Canaan, Rabbi Sacks, in fact, in his book, Not in God's Name, has a whole chapter on what he calls hard texts, difficult texts. And he says that there are some texts which don't sit well with an environment in which you want to try and curb violence, curb power. And he actually relates to these things. And he says, we sometimes have to turn back to our texts and look at Torah Sheba'al Peh. I imagine about the 7 nations of Canaan, he would turn to the Rambam, Maimonides, and to Nachmanides, who both say that before you go to war, first you call for peace. He talks about the notion of Amalek, and he says, Amalek becomes a concept once we get to the time of Chazal, and it was Maimonides who ruled that any Amaleki who adopts basic morality is not an Amaleki if there is such a people anymore. So for Rabbi Sacks, indeed, he was challenged by some of these texts. He said we have to find ways in which to reinterpret them or to see them from a contemporary moral standpoint. But does that go some way? By the way, I just want to say one thing. We should make a difference possibly between power and violence. What I was arguing was very much my article is about power, which is like a political power,
Right.
and not necessarily about violence per se. But we can talk about violence as well in a little bit.
Yeah, no, like we can actually jump into that a little bit right now. I mean, you have this I mean, we can jump ahead a little bit even. It's like right now we have the need to exercise not just power, right? We've had that certainly since 1948, but of course had long before that. But since 1948 to a large degree, and previously as well, and especially since October 7th, there's been a necessity to exercise, physical violence, and it might not be what we would have chosen, but there's no question that is a mandate, and I think there's no question that the larger theme, of violence, and then I know there's a distinction, but I think it's not a coincidence that we also have, we're building on top of Ben-Gurion's statism, right? To have these ideas, they're connected even if they're not conflated. What would Rabbi Sacks say? This is all a b'diavad, and we need to just curb the violence and the physicality, the deaths as much as possible. How would Rabbi Sacks really grapple with some of these hard questions, today?
Yeah,
really...
Rabbi Sacks. First of all, Rabbi Sacks wasn't a pacifist, and he really did believe in the importance of the state of Israel defending being able to defend the Jewish people. And I can only I can only relate to a couple of things that he wrote. And for those who would like to read some of Rabbi Sacks on this, I would advise you to take a look at his article on the rape of Dinah and
Yeah.
it's a very powerful article where he talks about it. One of the things that he used to love quoting was a book called Exclusion and Embrace by Miroslav Volf, who survived the whole episode in the Balkans with that war in the and I want to maybe even read in this regard a passage that Rabbi Sacks quoted more than once, and this is from Miroslav Volf, and then I'll tell you how Rabbi Sacks dealt with it. And he says, I suggest Miroslav Volf is talking to Christians, right, who are looking for turning the other cheek and for endless love. And he says, I suggest imagining that you are delivering a lecture in a war zone. Among your listeners are people whose cities and villages have first been plundered, then burnt and leveled to the ground, whose daughters and sisters have been raped, whose fathers and brothers have had their throats slit. The topic of the lecture, a Christian attitude to violence. The thesis, we should not retaliate since God is perfect, non-coercive love. Soon you would discover that it takes the quiet of a suburban home for the birth of the thesis that human non-violence corresponds to God's refusal to judge. In a scorched land soaked in the blood of the innocent, it will invariably die. And as one watches it die, one would do well to reflect about many of the other pleasant captivities of the liberal mind.
Hmm.
Quite a statement. And Rabbi Sacks adds, he says, I'm writing this essay in the summer of 2014. Israel is engaged in a bitter struggle with Hamas in Gaza, and many people have been killed. The state of Israel has no more desire to be engaged in this kind of warfare than did our ancestor Jacob, where it says, Vayira Yaakov Vayitzer lo. He was afraid and distressed. Chazal say, afraid lest he be killed, distressed lest he be forced to kill. And he then quotes somebody else who says, never mind that. He says, violence defiles us all. It did then, it does now. So Rabbi Sacks didn't like violence, but understood, and not being naive, understood that there are times in which it must be wielded, that we do live in a blood-scorched land, and there are no easy answers to this. And he develops this through his understanding of the Parsha of Dinah, where he even quotes various different academics who it's very difficult to discern. We know there's a machloket Rishonim. Was Shimon and Levi correct, or were they not correct? Various academics see the first part of the story as very sympathetic to Yaakov, and the second part of the story is not. So he says, I'm dealing with this ambivalence by Yira Yaakov Vayetzer lo. He doesn't want to kill, he doesn't want to be killed, and that we don't have easy choices. I don't know if that makes it easier, but all I want to say is Rabbi Sacks wasn't naive about this, and he understood that there are times in which we have to invoke the Parshat HaMelech. We have to have a king who's meant to Asher Yitzei lefanenu, Asher Yavo lefanenu, who will go out to war. And maybe there's a reason why the first two kings, both Shaul and David, are essentially warrior kings, because in setting up a country, sometimes that is a quite an essential priority. By the way, you're 100% right that this underpins part of Rabbi Riskin's critique, because part of the essential foundational idea of Zionism was to give Jews power. There was a sense that we don't want to be powerless. Israelis like power. That's what that, to a certain degree, I'm talking from Israel. That's what we're here for. We're here not to be powerless. The original Zionist disdain of the Golos Jew was the weak and vulnerable Jew, and Israel set itself up in order to resolve that problem, at least in part. There were lots of other ingredients into Zionism, but so I think the Rabbi Sacks acknowledges that this is part of it, but this was part of the tension that I put into my article, because for Rabbi Sacks, the essential core of Judaism is so stripped of all these things, and then the question is, when we've been so embroiled in fighting for our lives, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, and it's so important, and it really brings to mind two questions, and we can take them one at a time. One is, I wonder aloud what Rabbi Sacks would say when so much of our time and energy as individuals, as a people, I'm here in America, but as you say, you're in Israel, You have, family, children that have been serving on and off for the last 2 years, and so on. When so much of our body politic and our emotional investment is in war and the exercise of power, let's start with this. Where would Rabbi Sacks, find the space for what he saw as collective grace, as you quoted him, for not here, but in the article, for what he sees as kind of the more essential elements of Avodat Hashem and of our mission? Is Sinai is just something that we want to get back to after we finish exercising power, or would you say that there's some way in this the Avad experience that we can find that commitment to Sinai as well?
So I would definitely say that I don't think, it's not for nothing we say Hashem was la'amo yitain, Hashem yivarech et amo v'shalom. We end off every tefillah about with the blessings for peace. I think ultimately we don't want to be al charbach is a statement which is said to Esav. Our dream is not. It wasn't. It was never the dream of the prophets, and to be engaged in violence all the time. This wasn't the mode in which we want to be existing. When you read through many of the parshiot in the Torah, I mean, the laws of war feature in Sefer Dorim because it was a very important need as they were going into the country. But we don't really see so much the laws of war, say, in Parshat Mishpatim or in Parshat Kedoshim. There we're interested in setting up a civil society which is the ability l'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai, to be a mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh, to be a holy nation and a kingdom of priests, and we want to try and set up the most moral, compassionate society that we can, a holy society. So I don't think we intend to be a warmongering nation. That doesn't mean, by the way, that, as I say, Rabbi Sacks will admit and will say very clearly that we want to be a country. He says that, Israel is the only place where a total Jewish experience is possible. It's the only place where we are a majority. It's the only place where we can exercise sovereignty. That's where Judaism belongs to the Reshut HaRabim, to the public domain, where Hebrew is our language, and where the Chagim form the pace of life. Rabbi Sacks did say, however, that, and I would agree with him from a Tanachi perspective, that we've always got to be worried about kochi v'otzim yadi asali et ha'chayil hazeh. We're not meant to be too much resting in our power. And, for example, one of the concepts, why are we somehow between the superpowers? You've got Mesopotamia, in the north, and you've got Mitzrayim, and God, Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotzeiticha me'ur kastim, Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim. We're not meant to be a superpower with a big river. We're meant to be, as he calls it, right? This is the land which makes you look up to God. We rely on the rain. Tonight we start saying V'tein talu matar in Israel. We are meant to look to God for the rain. So we're meant to look to God for our security. So I do think he's digging into core values. He's not being non-Zionist in some way by trying to adopt a different agenda, right? There are times there's, a milchama and eight shalom, but we hope for eight shalom. And in that regard, I don't think he was wrong for trying to put the emphasis on that. And Rabbi Sacks, even in his secular writing, so to speak, in his political writings, is very much looking for where civic society is and the notion of how we build the body politics of our societies.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But before that, you had mentioned earlier that Rabbi Sacks makes a big deal out of the fact that violence can cause a stain. And I recall there were even controversial moments in his life when he would talk about this, and there was some even pushback that he received for emphasizing this at one point, if memory serves.
By the way, he was his predecessor, Rabbi Emanuel Jacobovitz.
Yes,
got in a lot hotter water as a result.
Yes,
I will never forget. I will never forget when I was with my university and we went to a visit in the East End of London, which was predominantly Muslim. And we went to visit a mosque, and I came out. This was during the time of Rabbi Jacobovitz, and I came out, and there were the billboards like what you would have in New York, the Daily News or whatever it is. This was the Evening Standard, and the headline was "Chief Rabbi Shames Israel." and Rabbi Jacobitz had made. I'm there in this, like, with these Muslims all around. I'm there with my kippah. I didn't even know where to put myself. And Rabbi Jacobitz had made a statement like, the Palestinians need statehood. Its occupation is wrong. Um,
Yeah.
I liked the way that Rabbi Sacks quoted Shimon Peres, where Shimon Peres, we all know that he was looking for a peace deal with the Palestinians, and he quoted Shimon Peres by saying, "There is light at the end of the tunnel. The light at the end of the tunnel is a Palestinian state. The only problem is there is no tunnel."
Right. Oh, fair. Yeah. So, yeah, but just so that's humorous and places things, I think, in perspective as well. And by the way, it would be interesting for another conversation, maybe to track these statements against, the current chief rabbi and to see have the expectations or what kind of like is, mainstream or controversial, from a chief rabbi around these issues has shifted in Great Britain as a result of October 7th. But you
By,
want to
by
jump
the
in
way,
quickly? Yeah.
one other thing which Rabbi Sacks had in common with Rabbi Jacobitz is talking about power, is they always used to say that, comparing the chief rabbinate in England with the rabbanut in Israel,
Yeah.
they always used to say, in Israel, the rabbanut has power, but it lacks influence.
Right.
Whereas in England, there is no power to the chief rabbinate, but it has far more influence.
Yeah.
So they were playing off this notion
Mm,
of power, actually having legal
yeah.
impact
Yeah. And I
as
know you
opposed to
mentioned,
influence.
yeah, go ahead. Sure. Yeah, no, and I know you mentioned toward the end of your article that this is one of the places where for you, Rabbi Sachs's thought really resonates most in terms of the impact of the chief rabbinate. It's interesting also that I was working on some of his sermons, and I wrote about this in my article as well, that from this you find this skepticism about the chief rabbinate of Israel's ability to have real meaningful influence. He was talking about this quite vociferously from his time as a pulpit rabbi, going back to, I believe, even the very end of the 1970s when he was just starting out. This almost reads like one of the consistent threads really across, almost a pet peeve, perhaps one might suggest, for Rabbi Sacks. And your insight that it might be drawing on the inverse kind of to his personal experience as chief rabbi, or playing off that, I think is very interesting as well. So I appreciate that. You mentioned about this concern about the dangers, though, of violence, et cetera, and that's, and that was something that really concerned Rabbi Sacks, that it can leave a stain, and that we need to think about and be honest with ourselves and grapple with the moral implications of exercising power, and in particular, exercising violence as necessary. Um, how do you imagine, Rabbi Sacks might have spoken out, or if we want to avoid playing that game, what do you think you're drawing on his thought, might emerge organically, in terms of, for example, would he speak out against settler violence today? I mean, like really to understand these kinds of things, right now, or certain incidents, during the war, would he have had a different approach during wartime than at other times? Like, how do you see this allergy to the dangers and sensitivity to the dangers of power to really playing out in with his public voice in today's world?
Yeah, I actually have a tendency to think that that in the last 2 years he would have just been a staunch supporter of
Hmm.
Israel on
Yeah.
every possible channel, and he would have
Hmm.
realized, and he was very savvy in this regard, that anything
Hmm.
he said, which even if he had in his heart a sense that maybe Israel could calibrate things slightly differently or guide things differently, I'm sure he would have understood that it would be used by the other side as something which would be, counterproductive.
Hmm.
So I tend to think, I mean, again, it's impossible to second guess,
No.
but I tend to think he would have put, 99% of his energy into representing Israel, and,
Hmm.
his unbelievable speech, which he gave. I always liked the fact that he wasn't afraid to go into the lion's den and speak, in unpopular things in certain forums. His famous speech about anti-Semitism he gave in the plenum of the EU Parliament, of the
Hmm.
European Parliament. He went into the Vatican and decided to speak about the value of family. I find it so fascinating that, he chose certain places to
Hmm.
push certain things which were actually counterintuitive in those places, and clearly he thought about those things. Um, and he always felt he was on a very important mission. So,
So you're saying even more so the last 2 years, you're saying, if I understand correctly, although generally that was his understanding, you're saying in particular last years with the microscope, on and an understanding of the larger context, you only imagine that he would have even more heavily focused his energies in
it's
that
my
direction.
instinct, but I've got
Yeah.
no, it's nothing empirical that I
Yeah,
can bring in order to prove it.
it's
But
very
I want
interesting.
to let me turn the focus back because it's important for our listeners. Rabbi Sacks was really interested in civic society more than anything else. When you take
Hmm.
his political philosophy, he wrote a book in 1997 called The Politics of Hope. He was
Yeah.
even earlier, his first set of public lectures, which he gave called the Wreath Lectures in 1991, were
Hmm.
all about the how religion is uh, disappearing within society, and what is going to be the glue that is going to hold society together. And he
Hmm.
always talks about the idea that you have government, but government can't instill values. Government is actually an arena of power. And you also have economic forces, which are arenas of greed or arenas of money. But what's going to give the values in society? And therefore, he was constantly interested to know where the values of society come from. And he was very worried that society would be left with just these economic clashes, political clashes, and the values which should underpin Western society, which came from Judeo-Christian heritage, were the liberal world had sort of allowed a room for human choice, but now we were in a libertarian world where there was no room to really, or even the values that were spoken were really interests and not values. And his answer was that this is going to come not from, don't look to government, the individual alone can't survive. We need to strengthen different groups, associations, schools, religions,
Hmm.
and this he saw as the sort of counterbalanced forces to powerful forces. He was very nervous that all you would have is powerful governments, and he said democracy can easily be eroded unless people understand for what they live and what are the values which underpin them. So to me, that was really one of the foundations of Rabbi Sacks' political philosophy, and
Yeah.
that's one of the things that he fought for, and therefore he fought very hard for the family because he felt the family was the place where we learned a lot of these things.
Yeah, 100%. And I know that Rabbi Sacks himself, and for example, the home we built together, and in other contexts, took this idea. He of course connected it to covenant, which you mentioned earlier, and talked about that kind of one element of this kind of civic society that's very important, and kind of the bedrock upon which, to use your metaphor from earlier, government and the state are meant to be sitting, is really the theme of a national narrative. And you mentioned this, and Rabbi Sacks, of course, appreciated the United States of America. So in terms of the and saw the inauguration as a kind of a reenactment of the renewal of the covenant, this whole theme. And then I know you touched on this in your article, and I know that Rabbi Sacks touched on this a little bit, but wanted to be tentative in terms of prescriptions for Israel. But obviously the divisiveness across the West, but Israel is far from an exception. I imagine you would agree. And so thinking about this theme of a kind of a shared narrative for Israel in particular, from your vantage point, is there anything to tease out of Rabbi Sacks for thinking about what that might be? And do you think that that's I'm sure he would have been hopeful that that's still within
Right.
reach, but how do you think we can actually
Right. So
help
in
that
his
to
in his book
materialize?
Future Tense, Rabbi
Yes,
Sacks takes on the whole notion of Medina Israel, and he does spend
yes,
a long time talking about the presidential inaugurals and talks about America as almost being self-aware that it is a covenantal society
right.
based on sort of almost biblical paradigms.
Mhm.
Um, and he asks the question. He says, what would be our fundamental sort of covenant? And he speaks about how there have been various different attempts to, there's been Tov Lamut Ba'aretz, it's good to die for one country, which he said is certainly not a Jewish value, and various others. And he comes out against Ben Gurion's mamlachtiyut,
Right.
statism, which
Mm.
he says that it was essential to start to create a state. But he says this idea of almost making the state into the be all and end all, that is a value in its own right. Again, if I would put it in the language that we've already spoken about, it's like putting the melech before the covenant of Sinai, putting the king before Sinai. What what does he want to see? And essentially, Rabbi Sacks wants to go back to the core idea of Judaism, which, maybe is called, we would call tzedek u'mishpat, right? He talks about this notion that in his ideal situation, Medina Israel would be an environment in which, we uphold the values of justice and looking out for people and and being a just society. Now, I have to say that this was one of the interesting places where this really gave me pause for thought, also in the current situation, because if you take the situation since the 7th of October, um, well, first of all, even let me before 7th of October, let me just say that there are many ways in which Israel is an exemplary society in that regard. The Israeli
Mhm.
health system, which makes sure that everybody has access to pretty high level health for free. And it's not for free, we all pay it out of our taxes, but those people who don't pay taxes get the same healthcare as I do. And um, and I pay quite a lot of taxes. So we all contribute into these kupot cholim, and everybody has access to really excellent medical services. The the social services that we have here, which provide for so much of the population. So in many ways, this idea of tzedek mishpat is very, very powerful within our society, and we wouldn't have had a whole argument about the legal reform here in Israel if it wasn't that there was actually a very strong sense of mishpat within society. So first of all, I would be willing to argue that it's not just that we have systems of state, but the civic space doesn't have the systems which actually reflect many Jewish values. I think they do. But let me go back to a post 710 situation. Many people have commented that on that 7th of October, that awful day, the big systems failed, and and it was the army, and even then, in the wake of that, over the next few weeks and months, it took a long time for government systems to be there in order to pick up the slack for the evacuees and for those people who were the survivors of the various different kibbutzim and yeshuvim that had been attacked. But who did pick that up? Who stood there? It was literally civic society. It was the miluimnikim who came out with
Wow.
150%. It was volunteers who came out to clothe and help and feed all of those evacuees. I think Rabbi Sacks's vision, in other words, if
Mm.
anything comes out of this, looking back at this, we can actually say that one of the most powerful things has been Am Yisrael, has been actually those
Mhm.
energies which are contained within this nation. It's one of the things we can be most proud of. And I'll say something else about the role of religion. Look at the hostages have come back. Each one is talking about
Mm.
religion. There are statistics which say that in the 18 to 35 age bracket, the interest in religion over the last 2 years has grown by many tens of percentage points amongst young people. Now, here's a great example where this is not coming from the Rabbanut. This is not coming from state. This is coming from the Shetach, from the grassroots. And in many ways, I don't know whether this verifies or I don't know exactly how to play this out, but I think, when Rabbi Sacks was talking about the idea that where is society? Do we just have state mechanisms and then we're lots of atomized individuals with a very sort of neutral public space where, all people do is go to the mall and watch Netflix? And
Mm.
and suddenly we're seeing that Am Yisrael have phenomenal resilience, phenomenal values, values of solidarity, values of chesed, values of arevut, of mutual responsibility, Jewish values, values that they really understand the need to stand up in order to protect themselves. In that regard, that's actually a very powerful expression of much that Rabbi Sacks was looking to talk about. Now, the interesting thing is, you can argue, where exactly has it come from, right? Is it sort of in that Jewish DNA that, we've gone 3,500 years through history and it's sort of in there? Has it? But but that's a fascinating situation.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think it's also a beautiful way to bring our conversation to a close, which is that on the one hand, I think that we're instant. I think your point is so insightful because we're drawn to the ways in which the need to exercise power and the need for the state to play a larger than life role in certain very essential decisions for our future. I think our very much our attention and our focus tends to go there, and understandably and rightly so. But I think, Rav Alex, what you've done is help us to see kind of the other side of the coin. There's a dimension of Rabbi Sacks's thought that allows us to see that in these moments when, on the one hand, the government has to step forward and make very difficult decisions as a body politic, that there's a way that's kind of the course of our community and its fabric and its kind of most essential nature really is determined by not just the Brit Sinai, but by really that sense of Klal Yisrael. And to see that sense of optimism, to see how organically it emerges from the thought of Rabbi Sacks in such a powerful way. I want to thank you really on not just behalf of myself, but really of all of our listeners and all of our readers for really bringing that to the fore in such a beautiful way. So thank you.
Thank you so much for Tzvi, and I just want to also thank the editors of Tradition. You're one of them, and Rabbi Jeff Sacks and Rabbi Sam Liebens, Rabbi Dr. Sam Liebens, for all of his. It's just such a great initiative to be able to produce this volume in Rabbi Sacks's memory, and I believe it will be studied by many and will hopefully bring Rabbi Sacks more into the arena, maybe even the academic arena, to start studying his thought as one of the great thinkers of the Jewish people in the 20th century.